If you've been with this channel for a while, you'll remember the empty bucket. The image I used to describe Europe's air defense promises to Ukraine. A neighbor whose house is on fire, calling for help, and a well-meaning neighbor next door who keeps showing up with a bucket that every single time you check turns out to be empty. Communiques instead of missiles. Declarations instead of deliveries. That was the story a few weeks ago, and on the evidence at the time, it was the right story. This week, something different happened. The neighbor showed up again, and this time, there was actually something in the bucket. A name, a manufacturer, a price tag, signed partnerships with actual defense companies. And I want to walk you through exactly what's in it because I think this is a genuinely more serious effort than what came before it. But I also want to show you something that happened within hours of the unveiling. Something that I think tells you everything about whether this particular bucket is going to matter in time to do the one thing it's actually supposed to do, which is keep the house from burning down while it's still being built. Let's start with what was actually announced because the details matter here more than the headline. On Monday in Paris, Ukraine and 9 European countries, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Sweden, and the United Kingdom formally launched what they're calling the Integrated Anti-Ballistic Missile Coalition, built around a new interceptor system that Ukraine is calling Freya. This wasn't a side conversation at a larger summit. It was the specific product of a broader gathering, the Coalition of the Willing, which brought together roughly 25 world leaders in Paris to work on security guarantees and a common negotiating position ahead of any eventual peace deal with Russia. French President Emmanuel Macron stood next to Zelensky and called it a clear choice to protect Ukraine and build what he described as the Europe of defense. Zelensky, for his part, framed it as something close to existential. The threat of ballistic missiles in the world, he said, is only going to increase, and that's one of the direct consequences of the wars in both Ukraine and Iran. Freya, he said, has to become real. Here's what Freya actually is, and I think this is the part that separates this announcement from the vague joint production language we've heard from European leaders for the better part of 2 years. The system is being built by a Ukrainian company called Firepoint, the same manufacturer behind Ukraine's FP-1 deep strike drone and the Flamingo cruise missile that's been hitting targets deep inside Russia. Firepoint's interceptor, designated the FP-7.X, is designed to hit an incoming ballistic target at roughly 15 miles of altitude, and it's meant to slot into a larger system that also needs radar, tracking, and command and control infrastructure that Ukraine doesn't currently produce domestically. That's where the European partners come in. Germany's Hensoldt has already signed a memorandum to supply radar technology. Ukraine is in active talks with France's Thales, Italy's Leonardo, and Norway's Kongsberg for the remaining pieces. And the number that's driving all of this, the number that makes Freya genuinely interesting rather than just another well-intentioned press release, is the price. Reuters puts the cost of an FP-7.X interceptor at roughly $700,000 per unit. A single Patriot PAC-3 interceptor, the American system Ukraine has relied on for years, costs approximately $3.8 million. That's not a marginal difference. That's a system aiming to be more than 5 times cheaper per shot, which, if it actually works, would fundamentally change the economics of trying to shoot down a saturation-level Russian missile barrage rather than just adding a few more interceptors to an already strained supply line. Zelensky was explicit that this is his second major air defense track this month, not his first. Days before Paris, at the NATO summit in Ankara, President Trump pledged to let Ukraine build its own Patriot interceptors under license domestically, telling reporters, in his words, "We'll give them the right to make Patriots." So as of this week, Ukraine now has 2 parallel bets running simultaneously. One is a license to eventually manufacture the exact same American system it's been begging for since the earliest months of the war. The other is Freya, a homegrown, European-backed alternative, designed specifically to be cheaper and faster to scale. Layer onto that the fact that European leaders in Paris also pledged roughly 70 billion euros, something like $80 billion, in military aid for Ukraine this year alone, and on paper, this looks like exactly the kind of structural shift the earlier bucket story argued Europe hadn't been willing to make. Real manufacturers, real memoranda, real money attached to a real production plan. not just a promise to eventually get serious. So, let me give you the credit where it's actually due, because I don't think intellectual honesty allows me to simply repeat the empty bucket framing without acknowledging what's changed. The core criticism of Europe's approach to Ukrainian air defense for the past 2 years has been that it consists overwhelmingly of communiques rather than capability, declarations of solidarity rather than deliverable hardware. Freya is not that. It has a named manufacturer with an actual working prototype. Firepoint conducted what it described as a successful test of the interceptor back in June. It has signed industrial partnerships with specific, credible European defense companies rather than vague appeals to future joint production. And critically, it's being led by Ukraine itself, the country with 4.5 years of live-fire battlefield data on exactly what does and doesn't work against Russian ballistic threats, rather than being designed in a European ministry conference room with no combat feedback loop at all. If you're grading this purely on whether it represents a more serious commitment than what came before, the honest answer is yes, unambiguously. But here's where the story turns, and here's the part I think deserves the most scrutiny, because good news in a war this brutal has a way of getting reported without anyone doing the actual math on the timeline. Zelensky has said he wants Freya flying much sooner than the roughly 24 months it typically takes to stand up a Patriot production line. His stated target based on comments this week is something in the neighborhood of a year. Firepoint's own co-owner has claimed mass production of the interceptor itself could begin as early as August of this year. Those are genuinely optimistic numbers, and I want you to hold them up against what the people closest to Ukraine's actual defense industrial constraints are saying. A Ukrainian Defense Ministry advisor has warned that scarce subcomponents, the actual physical parts that go into these systems, could take 12 to 24 months to scale up, regardless of how quickly political will materializes. An independent analyst who specializes in missile defense told Reuters he would be, in his words, very surprised if this moves faster than 12 months. So even in the most generous reading, you are looking at a system that will not have meaningful operational capability for at least a year, and quite possibly closer to 2, running on the same kind of hardware supply chain constraints that have bedeviled every other Western weapons program since this war began. Now let's talk about what the actual production math looks like once Freya does come online, because this is the number I think should be the real headline of this story, and it almost never gets mentioned in the coverage. Russia is currently producing somewhere in the range of 700 to 800 ballistic missiles a year. Using the standard defensive rule of thumb, roughly 3 interceptors fired per incoming missile to ensure a reliable kill. Defending against that output requires something like 2,400 interceptors annually. Lockheed Martin, the maker of the Patriot PAC-3, delivered just over 600 of them last year, with a stated goal of reaching roughly 2,000 a year by 2030. Even at that future, not yet achieved production target, American output alone falls well short of what's needed to fully blunt a Russian ballistic missile campaign at current firing rates. Now add Freya into that equation at full projected capacity. Analysts estimate a Ukrainian production facility would add somewhere between 200 and 300 interceptors a year. That's a meaningful contribution. It is not, by any reasonable accounting, a solution to a gap measured in the thousands. Put the most optimistic version of both programs together, the 2030 Patriot target, and a fully operational Freya line, and you are still looking at a combined interceptor supply that falls significantly short of what would be required to reliably stop Russia's current missile output, in a war where Russia has every incentive to keep that output high for as long as the war continues. And I want to bring this back down from the abstract production math to what it actually looks like on the ground right now, this month, because the gap isn't a future problem. It's a present one. Ukraine reportedly managed to shoot down only 4 of the 54 ballistic missiles Russia fired at it this month. 4 out of 54. That's not a rounding error in an otherwise functional air defense network. That's a system that is, right now, in July of this year, failing to intercept the overwhelming majority of the most dangerous category of weapon being used against it. Compare that to where things stood even a year ago, when Ukrainian and Western officials were citing intercept rates for Patriot batteries in the range of 80 to 90% under favorable conditions. A drop from that level down to roughly 7% this month isn't explained by a sudden collapse in Ukrainian competence or crew training. It's explained by a simple, brutal shortage of interceptors relative to the number of missiles being fired at them, exactly the shortage both Freya and the Patriot license are meant to eventually address. Which brings me to the part of this story that I think is the real reason you should be watching this week, rather than filing it away as encouraging news and moving on. Hours after the Paris announcement, Russia launched a fresh ballistic missile attack on Kyiv. Kyiv's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, confirmed that air defense units were scrambling to repel the strikes early Tuesday morning, and that fires had broken out in the Holosivsky district of the city. This wasn't an isolated incident bookending an otherwise quiet week. Just days earlier, Russian missile and drone attacks across Ukraine on Saturday left 8 people dead. A guided bomb strike on Sumy killed 5 people, including a child, and injured 43 more. So the pattern here isn't subtle. In the exact same 72-hour window that European leaders were in Paris unveiling a genuinely more serious air defense initiative than anything that's come before it, Russia was simultaneously demonstrating, with real missiles against real civilian targets, exactly why that initiative is necessary and exactly how far away it currently is from being able to help. I don't think this timing is coincidental, and I don't think you need some elaborate theory of Kremlin messaging to explain why. If you are Moscow and you are watching Ukraine and 9 European countries hold a press conference about a missile defense system that, by the most credible independent estimates, won't have meaningful operational capability for at least a year, the rational response is not to pause and reconsider your strategy. The rational response is to recognize that you have a window, a specific bounded window of somewhere between 12 and 24 months, during which the exact threat this new coalition is being built to counter remains, for all practical purposes, undefended. And the way you exploit that window is by doing precisely what Russia did within hours of the Paris summit ending. Keep firing, keep the pressure on Ukrainian infrastructure and civilian morale, and let the gap between announcement and operational capability do the strategic work that Russian missiles are currently doing on their own. There's a broader dynamic here worth naming directly, because I think it explains something about how this entire war has actually been fought on the Western side since the beginning. Every major structural response to a Ukrainian shortfall in this war, from the initial HIMARS deliveries to the F-16 transfers to now Freya, has followed roughly the same shape. A period of acute crisis makes the shortfall undeniable. A coalition forms, genuinely committed this time, with real money and real industrial partnerships behind it. And then a production and integration timeline, measured in months if you're lucky, and years if you're not, opens up between the political commitment and the actual battlefield effect. Recall how long it actually took after the first F-16 pledges before Ukrainian pilots were flying combat sorties in them, or how many months passed between the first HIMARS announcement and the point where Ukraine had enough rounds to use the system at real operational tempo rather than rationing every shot. Russia, whatever its own well-documented economic strains, has consistently proven willing and able to operate inside that gap, adjusting its own tactics and its own firing rates to exploit exactly the window between Western promise and Western delivery. That's not a uniquely cynical observation about this specific coalition. It's simply the pattern this war has followed for 4.5 years, and Freya, for all its genuine merit as a program, is the latest test of whether that pattern can finally be broken or whether it's simply repeating itself with a new acronym and a lower price tag. It's worth noting what else was on the table in Paris that same day, because it shows this wasn't purely a missile defense photo opportunity, even if the missile defense piece is what made headlines. The same gathering of leaders discussed how to further squeeze Moscow's revenue streams, specifically targeting what's known as the shadow fleet, the tankers with deliberately opaque ownership structures that Russia uses to keep exporting oil around existing sanctions regimes. The European Union is set to adopt its 21st sanctions package against Russia within the coming week. Leaders also used the summit to advance the concept of a future multinational force in Ukraine, a proposed security guarantee structure built around land, air, sea, and training components that would, in theory, underwrite whatever peace settlement eventually gets negotiated. Poland's prime minister confirmed his country would host joint coalition of the willing military exercises this fall, specifically to build credibility around that future force. None of this is irrelevant, and I don't want to wave it away as noise. But notice the pattern one more time. A missile defense system that needs a year to become real. A security guarantee force that exists, for now, mostly as a concept awaiting autumn exercises to prove it can function at all. A 21st sanctions package aimed at revenue streams that have already survived 20 previous packages. Every piece of this Paris summit, examined individually, is a genuine, serious effort. Examined together, as a snapshot of where the war actually stands after 4.5 years, it is a picture of an alliance still building the infrastructure of a sustained response in year 5. While the adversary that infrastructure is meant to counter keeps firing in real time this week using weapons it already has in full production. I also want to flag the American side of this story, because I think it's been somewhat overshadowed by the excitement around Freya, and it deserves its own scrutiny. Trump's pledge in Ankara to let Ukraine build its own Patriot interceptors under license is being widely reported as a significant concession, a real escalation of American support. But look at what that pledge actually is, structurally. It is not a commitment to send more American-made interceptors. It is a commitment to hand over the intellectual property and manufacturing rights so that Ukraine can eventually, on its own timeline, with its own supply chain constraints, build the things itself. That is a meaningfully different kind of commitment than simply increasing deliveries from existing American production lines, and it's worth asking directly why the administration chose the license model over the delivery model. A license costs Washington very little in the near term. It doesn't compete with America's own stockpile needs that, as we've discussed on this channel before, are already stretched thin after the Iran conflict. And it lets the administration claim credit for a historic step forward in Ukrainian self-sufficiency, while the actual production timeline, just like Freya's, stretches out well beyond the point where it can help with this month's 50 missiles, or next month's, or the one after that. Even Zelensky's own language at the Paris summit points toward this same uncomfortable truth. In the same set of remarks where he was celebrating Freya and the broader coalition, he was also asking urgently for a much more mundane and much more immediate form of help. 100 Patriot interceptor missiles a month through the winter, 300 total, from existing stockpiles, not from any future production line. That's the real tell here. If Freya and the Patriot license were genuinely sufficient answers to Ukraine's air defense crisis, Zelensky wouldn't need to be simultaneously begging for 300 missiles off the shelf from partners who already have them sitting in inventory. The fact that he's doing both, celebrating the long-term structural fix while pleading for the short-term emergency supply, tells you which of the two problems is actually getting solved this month, and which one is still, in the most literal sense, still on the drawing board. So where does this leave the empty bucket metaphor I started with? I think it needs an update, not a retraction. The bucket this week is real. It has a manufacturer's name on it, a price tag that actually makes structural sense, and signed agreements with companies that have real production capacity rather than just good intentions. That's meaningfully different from where things stood a few weeks ago, and I don't want to undersell that shift. But a bucket that won't be finished for a year in a war where the house is measurably still burning tonight this month at a rate of 4 intercepted missiles out of 54 fired is still, for all practical purposes right now, an empty bucket. The difference is that this one, unlike the vague joint declarations that came before it, actually has a plausible date on which it stops being empty. Whether Freya hits that date, whether the subcomponent shortages the Ukrainian government's own advisors are warning about get resolved faster than history suggests they will, and whether Kyiv survives the next 12 months of exactly the kind of strikes we watched happen hours after this announcement was made, that is the story I'll be watching. And it's the story I think everyone covering this war should be watching too, instead of simply reporting the press conference and moving on to the next headline. Watch Firepoint's production numbers over the coming months. Watch whether that August mass production target actually holds. And watch this week and every week after it how many of Russia's ballistic missiles Ukraine is actually able to shoot out of the sky while the world waits for the bucket to fill. I'll be back to walk you through it as it develops.